Hello and welcome from the Sonoran Desert in beautiful Tempe, Arizona. This is Politics in the Past with Robert Ferguson. Today, this is something a little bit different we're trying. It's going to be the first ever Gen Z roundtable with two outstanding undergraduates here at Arizona State University who are both associated with the Politics and Leadership Club. I invited them today because I'm really curious about really, I guess, Gen Z's politics. We've seen a tremendous we've seen a tremendous change in my lifetime from how Gen Z was perceived by others and how Gen Z approached their politics. And so I couldn't think of any two better people to bring in to discuss this than Jack and Jake. So why don't you guys introduce yourselves and we'll go from there.
I'm Jack Henricks. I'm a junior here at Arizona State University studying political economics. About a semester and a half ago, Jake drugged me to my first Politics and Leadership Club meeting.
I want to be clear, he did not say drugged you. He
No.
dragged you.
Yep. Pardon me. And he hasn't let me leave, so now I'm one of the vice presidents. And I work in the Center for American Institutions doing research and communications.
Awesome. A lot of what Jack said is going to sound very similar. My name is Jake Dewick. I'm also a junior at Arizona State. I am studying history and political science. I'm currently the president of the Politics and Leadership Club. I've been around the club for a couple years now, and I also work for the Center for American Institutions as a research aide.
Excellent. All right. Well, I want to get to know you guys a little bit better, and I want the audience to get to know you guys a little bit better. So, Jack, we're going to start with you. Jack and Jake does make this a little bit difficult. I'm going to be honest. What I'm doing, what I'm leading this discussion, but I'm going to do my best to keep it straight. So, Jack, can you tell us a little bit about where you're from and how you ended up at Arizona State University?
Sure, I'm from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and which is why I say fun things like drug and Dakota. Um, and I ended up at Arizona State University because I was really intrigued by the sustainability degree and program at ASU. Environmental sustainability is something I became very passionate about in the Boy Scouts. And I wanted to go to a university where I could sort of engage in those passions. And that's something that ASU has allowed me to do.
Jake? Mine's not as inspiring as that. I grew up about 15 minutes from campus, sort of at the west end of Mesa, Arizona. I've lived there my whole life. I'm a big fan of Arizona, a very, very passionate local. I came to ASU because, well, it's down the street and it's a good school. And it's one of my goals to at least get through undergrad without any sort of debt, because I have law school down the road. And so far, we're good.
Good to hear. Any idea on what type of law you want to practice?
I've been thinking about it. I get that question a lot. There's so many different types of law to go into. Right now, I am a legal intern at a criminal defense firm, and I can say that that work is very, very interesting. But there's also just so much outside of the criminal justice system, from patent law to environmental law, juvenile law, constitutional law, water policy, all that kind of stuff. And I think it would be a little foolish of me to settle on one kind of law before I've seen it all and before I've even gone to law school.
Well, there is like the first couple of years of law school are designed to help you with that a little
Right.
bit. The one thing that I will say that I hear a lot of my lawyer friends tell me about criminal law is that it's one of the few types of streams of law where you still do litigation. So if you end up in many other types of streams of law, you may never end up in front of a judge more than once or twice in your career. Whereas in criminal law, that's guaranteed to happen a lot. So even if you don't end up there permanently, it might not be a terrible place to start out.
This is true.
From a career perspective. Okay, so we've got a little bit about your backgrounds. How did you guys get interested in politics? We'll start with Jack.
I've been interested in politics my whole life. My grandparents on my mom's side are political junkies, and they go to the Minnehaha County Fair every year and register voters, circulate petitions. And my parents started sending my brother and I to the fair with them in the summers. I assume because it was free childcare. Um, and my brother didn't really like it, but I latched onto it immediately. I thought it was fascinating, and I thought that we were doing something really worthwhile. And that's sort of my political origin story. I've been doing that work and getting more interested in the issues my whole life.
So before you jump in here, Jake, sorry, it's the County
Minnehaha County Fair.
Minnehaha County Fair.
Yeah.
Okay, I expect that the Minnehaha County Fair is a lot of fun.
The Minnehaha County Fair is not the best county fair in South Dakota. For that, you should drive down to the Turner County Fair in Parker. But it's not the worst county fair I've ever been to either.
I expect there's lots of fried food.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, no, well, I mean, my favorite thing about county fairs is going to see the giant livestock. That's my absolute favorite.
I'm a big fan of giant livestock. I'm a big fan of butter livestock. You see the butter cows and the butter turkeys and the butter pigeons. Really, any kind of butter animal makes my Midwestern heart go aflutter. And I think that there's something beautiful and frankly beautifully American about butter animals.
Well, there's some Midwestern boosterism right there. So, Jake, county fairs, Maricopa County Fair, where are we at?
I can't say I've ever been to a county fair. If there is one, I know nothing about it. My interest in politics is related to my interest in law and my interest in government. I've always been more interested in the policy side of politics, less so about the primaries and the elections and all the partisan bickering that we've been seeing for the past couple decades. I haven't canvassed for any campaigns, but I have worked as an election worker for a few elections, scanning IDs, helping people get their ballots, that kind of thing. I think that the procedural stuff and the actual work that goes behind implementing policy and enforcing the rules and making an actual difference in people's lives has always been more interesting to me than the rhetoric and often empty words of political campaigning and promises that often don't get fulfilled. I'm interested in the promises that do get fulfilled.
I like how you put that. So, Jake, for people who've never been involved in the procedural side of things, or people who've never really, I mean, even as simple and both of you, Jeff, both of you guys mentioned this, like registering people to vote, volunteering even at that level, and you've been involved in some other things as well, obviously. But for those who've never been involved in the procedural side of things and have maybe only engaged in politics in a more partisan manner, and partisan is not even the right way to put it, in a in a more distant manner. What do you think is different from when you're actually an agent in politics versus maybe when you're more of a spectator?
Hmm. That's a really good question. I mean, what I find interesting about the procedural stuff that you might not see from the outside is how complex it is, but also how much thought goes into it. Like, this is the result of a lot of deliberation and arguing and lobbying. And it's interesting to see. I hesitate to use the word convoluted because that has a negative connotation, but how intricate it is. There was something that we were researching for the center a few months ago. We were looking at different ways that states appointed their state Supreme Court justices, or in other cases, elected them. And I have to say that Arizona's method of appointing justices is extremely interesting. There are a lot of steps, lots of different processes and factors and actors involved, but it's very clear that it's genuinely intended to produce the best kind of justice possible and a justice system that operates with the most integrity possible. It's that kind of thought and deliberation and reason that I find enticing about the actual meat of policy that's often absent from politics. And I think that's what turns a lot of people off of politics sometimes, is that there's a lot of talking and not a lot of doing.
Hmm. I mean, I really like how you put that. That's interesting. It also is really hard to capture in arguments over Twitter or even or in a TikTok video,
Absolutely.
Mhm.
right? I particularly like what you mentioned, the amount of how intricate and how much deliberation goes into these processes. Um, it is pretty interesting. It is impressive when you actually engage on that level. And I think it gives people, maybe people who don't have that experience, sometimes are left with like really big questions as to why a thing is happening, which seems maybe very, very foreign. But if you're involved in the process, you sort of see, okay, it's one cog in a bigger wheel.
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Interesting. Okay. So, this is one of the reasons that I really wanted to talk with you gentlemen is not only are you associated with the club, but you think about politics, you both think about politics in a very analytical way. And just you're not just participants, you're not just fighting for your side, for a political side or anything like that. You're analytical. And so one of the first, so what I'm hoping to get today is, again, trying to trace this transformation of Gen Z's politics from a very hyper radical emergence to something else entirely over the course of about 10 years. So, when I say Gen Z, what do you guys think of? Start with Jack.
When I think of Gen Z, it's hard for me to sort of put a snappy title on it because I'm a member. And so I see it with a great deal of nuance. But I see a generation that has been shaped by the internet and social media in ways that nobody understands, and nobody's going to be able to understand for decades. And furthermore, a generation that sees itself as very small individually, growing up in such a globalized world, in a world where they are aware of how many people there are and how many different ideas there are and different stories there are. It takes care of your ego very quickly. And so a generation that's very aware that it is an insignificant piece in the world as it exists today and the world over the totality of human existence.
Hmm. Jake?
I would probably agree with a lot of what Jack said. I think Gen Z is defined by the fact that we are the first generation to not know what the world was like before the internet. I mean, I think Gen Z is maybe 1996 to 2010, births in that range.
I think you're correct. Yeah.
So we're somewhere towards like the back half, but we grew up with the internet, with Google Maps, with smartphones, and we don't remember what it was like without that. And I think that ties into what Jack said about us almost feeling small is because we have the internet. We are almost overexposed to the complexity of the world and how much is happening because there is a lot that is happening all the time, but we have more access to all of it more now than ever. And I think that's another defining feature about Gen Z is that if anything, our generation thinks too big picture and not enough small picture. Like because we're so caught up in everything that's happening around the world, we often miss what's happening right around us in our communities, and we're often not tied down to any one place that we can call home.
Interesting. That's really interesting. There was somewhere else I was initially going to go, but I want to pull on this string. This idea that you never even really get to know your area. You're immediately thrown into the entire world. As you mentioned, all of the people, all of the ideas. And so you're right. That had never occurred to me that to somebody who's interested in politics that's in Gen Z, obviously you have to make huge changes if you're going to solve anything because you can't even imagine how your local community shapes you. All you see are these global forces.
Exactly.
Interesting. And I think one of the other things that one of the criticisms that has often been leveled at Gen Z has been its narcissism. And yet, what I'm getting from you gentlemen is that, in fact, what there is almost this sense of insignificance.
I think that a lot of generations, older generations, that is, like to call the younger generation narcissistic. You saw that with the millennials. Famously, there was this trend of thinking, oh, well, millennials won't go into work, everything's handed to them. They don't understand how to uh, earn your due. And so I think that that's just something that happens. But in terms of Gen Z specifically, I think Jake is very insightful when he says that young people feel a sense of placelessness. We used to talk about regions politically. It used to be that the Great Plains would go one way and the industrial Northeast would go another way. And a lot of that's dissolved. Even the solid South has dissolved. And so, in terms of the effects that the internet is having politically, I do think that you see that in election returns and how fragmented our nation has become because each individual can now be an absolutely individual voter shaped by what they seek out on the internet and what their specific algorithm feeds them. It's not what their neighbors are telling them.
Interesting, interesting. So so what you're saying is for Gen Z voters, there's very little incentive to vote for your regional interest.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
You're voting for a global interest, not a regional interest.
Absolutely.
Yes, even if that global interest is counter to your local interest.
Right. Interesting. So, I mean, you guys don't know much about my own work, but my work as a historian is in the first half of the 20th century. And my analysis of politics is deeply informed by how regions vote. And so, I mean, what I'm studying is a totally alien world to what I'm generally seeing now because of that voting your regional interest versus as maybe, we can call it voting your global interest.
That's a good way to put it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
And if you don't know your local area, and I mean, we know our neighbors less and less, right?
Mhm.
Yes.
That it becomes even more difficult to form any sort of regional consciousness.
Absolutely.
Can I add on that?
Sure, please.
There's a quote that comes to mind. I think it's attributed to the Roman philosopher Seneca, but it's to be everywhere is to be nowhere. And I think that really captures a lot of the essence of what Gen Z struggles with is because you can connect with someone on the other side of the world. You can be passionate about wars that are happening thousands of miles away. But like you said, you don't know your neighbor. You don't know what's happening at home. I'm sure there are a lot more of us that could tell you about what's happening in Israel, but a lot less of Gen Z could tell you about issues with water policy in the state of Arizona, things that more directly affect them. And so I think there's a lot to talk about with accusations of narcissism. I think a lot of that is social media kind of just making your own curated world. But if you ask me, the accusations of narcissism are almost born out of Gen Z making up for this feeling of insignificance by pretending that they are maybe more significant than they actually are. And maybe that's not totally correct. And I'm sure that's not the whole picture, but it would be hard to convince me that that wasn't a factor, if that makes sense.
Makes total sense, at least to me. Y I think that makes a lot of sense. And really, for anybody listening, I mean, it is difficult to imagine, for me at least. Like, I mean, I'm much older than you, but not so much older than you that I mean, I'm 38. Um, I was born in 1986. I do remember the world before the internet, right? And, my formative years were certainly spent before smartphones, right? My early professional years were spent before I had email on my phone. So and I cert and, cameras on the phone were totally alien. That's a completely feels like a very new phenomenon to me. When somebody asks me, do you know anything about new music? I'll say, yes, I've heard of Taylor Swift. That kind of gives you an idea of of my age. But it is difficult to imagine how you don't try to make up for a certain degree of insecurity if you're in this global world and everything is shaped by things happening around the planet. And, I mean, one of the primary issues that was motivating people in Gen Z was climate change. I mean, how do you solve climate change in your neighborhood? You don't, right?
You really can't.
Yeah. And not only can you not affect it in your neighborhood, you're going to be affected by something that's happening across the world.
And the problem with that is you can't solve climate change in your neighborhood. But I would argue the only solution to climate change is neighborhood by neighborhood. And it's individuals coming together and making small collective decisions that then ripple out across a community. But because of the dissolution of, I had a great conversation with Dr. Webster the other day about
Who's Dr. Webster?
Dr. Joel Webster. He's a postdoc here at the center. And we were talking about Edmund Burke's Little Platoons, which are one of my favorite things to talk about.
Jack really likes the little.
So what's Edmund Burke's Little Platoon?
So Edmund Burke was an MP. Jake's chuckling. I talk about little platoons a lot. Edmund Burke was
exceedingly often.
was a British MP who was the father of the conservative ideology.
Modern, but you'd argue modern kind of conservatism within the liberal democratic framework.
Yes, absolutely. And he wrote a theory of how societies stay together and how civilizations are able to hold themselves together. And a key element of that was the notion that when people, regular people who don't agree with one another on politics, get together in an apolitical organization like a bowling league or a Boy Scout troop or a neighborhood association, a book club, anything like that, and just interact with one another, that's what makes society function. When you meet people who disagree with you and you learn about them and you become invested in their life, that's what makes society function. And Gen Z just has none of that. And so,
You are a generation of very lousy bowlers, I will say.
absolutely.
Yes.
And so when we're talking about big issues like climate change and how to solve that, previous generations would have said, well, I'm going to get together some of my friends and maybe we're going to, all be together with recycling. And then we can do single stream recycling because that's better for the environment. But so many people in Gen Z aren't the member of organizations and don't know their neighbors. So how are they supposed to solve climate change except by putting something on their Instagram story?
Well, and then what ends up happening is that rather than any productive actions, all you end up doing is shaming people.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And how does that go over?
Not well. I remember when that kind of ideology got really popular of just shaming, shaming, shaming. And I remember thinking what a terrible way that was to build a coalition. Like if If you're trying to sell someone a couch, you tell them how awesome the couch is and what a great deal you could get and how awesome you are and you deserve such a good couch. You don't insult the person. Be like, you're horrible. You need that. You need that couch because you don't take it. You're horrible. Like, no one has ever bought anything that way. I I remember thinking how silly it was that people thought that everyone would buy that ideology if you sold it in that manner.
Yeah. Yeah. I am perhaps, I might push back on you a little bit. I think shame can be a very powerful social motivator in the short term. I think
Yes.
in the
Mm.
long term, it's very damaging. But I think in the short term, politicians and political movements have used that very effectively, particularly radical ones.
Yeah.
Agreed.
But it only works in the short term. As soon as there's a different tomorrow, those people are just upset at you,
Yes.
and that will manifest itself in other ways. Okay. So again, I'm gonna when I first, when people first kind of became aware of this the Gen Z phenomenon, this group of this new generation, this new generation of barbarians who show up, was about 2014. So that's why I think your 1996 cutoff is about right, because that would have made them 18 in 2014. Actually, before we continue, what year were you guys born?
I was born in 2005.
I was also born in 2005.
Okay. So these people are 9 years older than you, right? And I mean, this is one of the other things that happens when you condense a generation, like 16 years of people's birth into like one. We try to describe them with like one profile. There's huge, the generation changes, right?
Mhm.
And so when this 1996, 1997, 1998, when they emerged on college campuses, they came with a flavor of radicalism that I think even leftists on campus, established leftists on campus, not only became nervous of, frightened of, but really did not understand. How do you guys remember that group of that more radical version of Gen Z, or what was your experience with them?
I remember a version of Gen Z. Granted, I was pretty young.
Of course.
I would have been about 10, and I remember thinking they were really cool. I remember thinking these are people because I was just beginning to understand there are problems in the world. There are people in the world who are suffering. And I remember thinking, oh, here are these group of young people who are going out and doing something about it. We're trying to do something about it. So I remember thinking that they were a really cool group of people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting. I mean, the kind of the person I immediately think of that generation is like Greta Thunberg,
Oh, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
She's striking for climate. She's this global personality. I mean, if you're 10, 11, 12 years old, or even if you're really interested in that type of activism,
Hmm.
that's electrifying stuff, right?
Yeah. And they would bring people like Greta Thunberg up in class as an example of, oh, you think you're young, you think you can't do anything. Here's a person who's just a little bit older than you, who's having a great impact on the world. And it was absolutely a success story that we were taught about in school.
Right. And so, Jake, I'm going to get to you in a second, but I'm just going to, again, I want to pull on this thread for a little while longer, Jack. So, were your teachers, how did your teachers approach this new activism and ideology in high school
In high school,
or middle school, high school?
sure, I think most of my teachers sensed that it was about to change because they had taught the earlier era of Gen Z that was more politically boisterous, shall we say. And then over the years, that sort of dissipated.
Interesting. So, they're sort of early, they had this early insight.
Oh, absolutely. They were a canary in the coal mine on that.
Okay. So, did they try to, um, were these teachers, advocating for this, or or do they seem sympathetic to the to the earlier ideology that they had taught, of the students that they had spoken to?
I think a lot of it depends teacher to teacher. I would say that, I went to public schools and I had a fantastic public school education. And so much of my public school education was built on free speech and built on the notion that if you have a belief, whatever that belief is, you should feel that you can advocate for it. And so I would imagine that for many of my teachers, the sense that some of that advocacy was dimming was distressing.
Hmm. Jake.
I'd have to I'd have to concur with a lot of what Jack said. Um, again, I was also like 10, so I wasn't super plugged in politically, but Greta Thunberg also comes to mind, and she definitely came up a lot in class. And I think what was different then, especially around 2014, was this kind of optimism about Gen Z. Like, wow, these kids are really cool. They're being really involved. They're super active. This is great for our world, that kind of thing. But I would like to add that that changed in 2016 when Donald Trump ran for the presidency and won. That really sort of shifted that optimism about the youth, or maybe just optimism in general. I had a very different experience in middle school versus high school, largely because the former was much more conservative and the latter was much more liberal. But I'd have to say that that trend kind of applies to both. There was a kind of optimism both demographics. But again, it changed around 2016 because the campaign of Donald Trump sort of made national politics everyone's deal. I remember in 6th grade, we would all argue about policies and candidates, and we never really understood what we were talking about. We were just parroting whatever our parents said. But the fact was that we were arguing about these things while we were 12, and we weren't doing that a couple years before.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's interesting. I mean, I think back to the 2000 election when I would have been 14, and I would have been probably like the one of very few people in high school. Now this was in Canada, but the same thing basically applies, I think, who would have been able to tell you who the Democratic nominee was and who the Republican nominee was. There might have been 6 people in my grade who could have told you that. I expect in 2016, when you were maybe a little younger than that, everybody knew who the candidates were.
Absolutely. Everybody knew and everybody had an opinion.
And a strong opinion, too.
Absolutely.
Interesting.
Absolutely.
Interesting. So you mentioned that this earlier group of more activists, the early Gen Z, who, again, very activist, radical in many ways, initially seemed very appealing and seemed cool. But, the teachers were witnessing in your high school were witnessing that activism dim. Why do you think that students saw that dimming? Jake, you mentioned it's maybe a loss of optimism. Um, what what else do you think? Or maybe we can go a little bit further on that. How do you think that sense of a lost optimism maybe changed the perspective of younger Gen Zers?
I think it changed the perspective in terms of where Gen Z was looking, especially the younger ones, because I think it goes without saying that a lot of Gen Z was pretty progressive, especially that early activist group. And again, with the election of Donald Trump, that kind of defeated the dreams of many of younger Gen Z. And I think this is around the time, 2014, 15, 16, when social media was really starting to take off and really starting to affect people my age. So instead of looking to these role models that were doing real work, it goes back to that policy discussion we were having earlier. They were looking to people on social media to tell them the things that they wanted to hear that they weren't seeing out in the real world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think we can I think we can kind of take that apart a little bit and maybe understand it a little bit in its parts. Because I think it's really insightful and important. So the as the younger Gen Z sees this flash of radical activism that seems very successful, of very young people being very successful, emerge into the world. And then if you're 13, 11, 12, 13 years old, it might look really cool. Oh my goodness, they're winning. And then in 2016, somebody who might be considered antithetical to all of that ends up winning office, but does not win the popular vote. Right. So I think there was my sense was, and you guys feel free to disagree with me here, but just building on what you were saying, Jake, is that as that earlier wave of Gen Z sort of saw Trump's election as an accident.
Absolutely. And almost like a last gasp, I would
Right.
say.
So that was my sense.
Yeah.
But at the same time, maybe if you're a little bit younger, you're coming into the world not as in triumph, but in defeat.
Yeah, I think so. And you have to remember that that election is really the first one that we really remember caring about.
Well, you mean you didn't really care about Romney Obama in 2012?
I was maybe 7 or 8. I think I cared more about Mario Kart at the time.
Probably. That's fair.
Now, if they had put Mitt Romney in Mario Kart, then maybe I would have
I
cared.
don't know that he would have been the most compelling character.
Probably not. But my point was that that election was all that we knew, at least to the extent that we were involved in it and that we felt involved in it. And I don't remember thinking that it was like a last gasp because I didn't have much to compare it to.
Right.
This was the norm. This kind of heated debate, this growing polarization was what we were being introduced to. And it wasn't the best introduction because I don't think that polarization is obviously like politics at its best. So I think that definitely contributed to the sort of deflating of that optimist mood.
I think Jake makes an excellent point here. And to build on it, the 2016 election is an important watershed because it marks a fundamental change in who people are talking about as a change maker in politics. Before 2016, people like Greta Thunberg, these younger people, were widely discussed. But the minute Donald Trump wins in 2016, the voters who are important are disaffected white working class voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. Those are the only people anybody can talk about. And so for people like Jake and I, who are just now gaining political awareness in 2016, we look out in the world and nobody's talking about us.
Yeah.
Everybody's talking about people who are 40 years older than us.
Interesting.
And that has to do with Donald Trump specifically. I think whether you like it or not, I think we can all agree that he is a master of capturing everyone's attention. And so when we had a couple years talking about, young Gen Z and activism, all this change we were doing, and then all people can talk about is this super old guy who's doing the opposite of what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
We kind of lost our spot on the stage, if that makes sense.
And then on the Democratic end of things, a different super old guy
Exactly.
who just harkened back to a different version of the past.
That we had no idea of really understanding, like the people that lived through it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I also wonder what the degree of, when you're, so how old were you guys in 2016 again?
11.
Yes.
11. Okay. So you're just about to embark on like the punk rock stage of your lives,
Yeah, that is the perfect way of putting it.
right?
Mm.
So you're about to embark on the punk rock stage of your life. And while Donald Trump might seem like the obvious opponent, right? Whatever Trump was, he never controlled the means of like the culture, the commanding heights of culture, right? And so, when you're a teenager, especially because you can't vote, you're not necessarily looking to change you're not necessarily always just looking to change the person in power. You're fighting against your parents. You're fighting against the schools. You're fighting against the movies that you're watching, the music that you're listening to. And so after 2016, the arts and the stuff that you're probably really going to consume as a teenager is being really infused with this hyper left-wing radical sentiment.
And I think a lot of that was reactionary too, almost fighting to get back to that spotlight because, again, we kind of got pushed out because Donald Trump really took over everyone's attention. And his first term was very different than this current term. It was much more establishment Republican. But I think that Gen Z definitely turned up the volume on their ideology and the extent of that radicalism because it was a fight not for what policy was implemented, but it was a fight for attention.
Interesting. That's right. Because 2014 is sort of, I think John McWhorter called it the woke apocalypse in 2014. And all of a sudden these new ideas emerge, right? Safe spaces, lots of different ideas about gender and all, and again, from a very radical perspective. And, and so that's where the energy is, right? Of Gen Z. And then all of a sudden they have 3 years where they feel like they're totally in control. And 3 years is a long time when you're 18, 19, or 20 years old. It doesn't seem very long to me, but it seems like a long time. And then you lose that power overnight, right?
Yes.
Politically, at least, or at least that maybe you don't lose the power, but all of a sudden the path changes. The hero's journey radically changes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And so now, especially when you have a Democratic Party that's trying to find a way to oppose Trump, there seems to be this interesting fusion of the Democratic Party and this radical activism, where liberals, more establishment liberals in the Democratic Party, are kind of searching for ways to oppose. And there's this fusion of interests with the more establishment Democratic Party and the more activist youth. Whereas if the 2016 election had gone differently and Hillary Clinton was president, I don't think you would have seen that union of interests,
I don't think so either.
because you would have had the liberal Democrats trying to defend the administration and the radical activists fighting against it.
Yes, absolutely.
I agree.
And so in 2016, when Trump wins, you get this weird fusion that's never comfortable. And the liberal activists, especially the geriatrics, are trying to speak like youths, but have no idea how to do it.
Yes. And I'd argue it's still uncomfortable.
I think it is still uncomfortable, yeah. But if you guys are emerging as in your punk rock stage, how's that going to look?
I mean, it's the old Will Rogers quote. I'm not a member of an organized party. I'm a Democrat. I cannot imagine an organization less suited to being punk rock than the Democratic Party of Bill Clinton and the Democratic Party of, to a degree, Barack Obama. It's a lot of things. It's fundamentally not punk rock. And so when you have this fusion of teenage political angst and also older activist generations who seek to oppose the Trump administration, there's just no way that coalesces well.
Right. And a message is going to emerge from it. There's going to have to be some coherency that they kind of impose on it, but it's going to be shallow,
Yes.
right? It's going to be very superficial. and I can only imagine that it is going to grate the ears of a 13-year-old or 14-year-old
Yes.
because they would recognize, oh, this is so inauthentic, right?
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah.
And so does the generation then, and I'm kind of asking, this is a leading question, so feel free to ignore it. But so what then, let me try to make it a non-leading question. What then does a younger generation who's become interested in politics because Donald Trump forces you to be interested in politics? What do? What does the generation do?
You build up as much as you can. You fight as much as you can because Donald Trump sort of requires that attention from you to a degree. And this is getting to the sort of end stage of Gen Z activism or where it is today. But there's only so much you can fight for an organization that fundamentally doesn't reflect you. And so eventually you waste away. And that gets to the state of almost apathy that I think Gen Z or many members of Gen Z finds itself in, where there's a fundamental belief, especially with the reelection of Donald Trump, that all of that earlier activism was for naught, and the Democratic Party fundamentally does not reflect their interests. And so why are we putting all of this effort in?
I think that's a good point. But also to counter, I think the other option to fighting very hard is to withdraw. And I think that's where a lot of Gen Z ended up anyway. They either withdrew right off the bat and started living in their own world, usually on the internet, or they fought like crazy, and it
So you think fought like crazy for left-wing idea, like radical,
Mostly,
yeah. Okay.
and then realize it wasn't doing anything, and then you kind of end up where everyone else was who withdrew anyway.
Right.
And so you kind of have this disaffected group of teens, which again, that's a feature of just being a teenager, is being disaffected with the world, and life isn't as simple as it was when you were 10. But again,
We're not gonna take it.
exactly right.
Mhm.
But I think that what was different, and then what we said was different about Gen Z at the very beginning, is that we had social media to turn to. We had so many more people to tell us the things that we wanted to hear. And we had a software that filtered out all the things that we didn't want to hear. And I think that is one of the major forces that contributes to the Gen Z criticism of narcissism. I think a better way to put it is just lack of self-awareness. Is because social media, especially because a lot of people turn to it out of apathy, made everyone their own little world. And I think a lot of those radical ideas really thrive there because they were unchallenged.
Right. So that takes us to about COVID, I think. All right. But then something really interesting starts to happen. I'm going to leave the pandemic. Maybe you guys want to bring the pandemic into this, but I'm going to just lead. I don't want to lead with the pandemic and might not be related to the pandemic. Why you start to see younger Gen Z begin to embrace, or at least a significant larger cohort than anybody thought possible, begins to start either embracing Donald Trump or embracing, there's a religious revival among Gen Z and embracing a more conservative worldview. And that sometimes borders into nationalistic, which is remarkable given where we started this conversation when we talked about Gen Z is born into this world of not even knowing their community. How does that, from the state of withdrawal and disillusion, how do we get there?
I think it's because people were looking for that community, whether they knew it or not. And depending on how you were raised or where you were at on the spectrum before all this happened, you kind of fell into these two camps because you were looking for that connection. You were looking for an in-group, something to validate you, to make you feel like you had power. And I do want to bring COVID into this because that just made everyone even more isolated than they already felt. They literally isolated, especially like as teenagers, not being able to, talk to friends in class or go hang out with anyone, just being stuck at home all the time. Really, the only sense of community you had was either what you had with your immediate family, and if that wasn't working out, whatever you had online. And like I said earlier, a lot of that just encourages echo chambers where people repeat the same ideas. They don't challenge each other, because if you challenge each other, then you're threatening your own in-group, and you can't get rid of that because during COVID, that's really all that we had.
Mm, interesting. Interesting. So let's just, how old were you guys, or what grade were you in March of 2020?
My freshman year of high school.
Same.
Wow.
It was our last quarter. It was the spring break that never ended.
Yeah.
So that you're 14 years old, 13 years old?
I think I had just turned 15.
Yeah, 15.
Okay.
Mhm.
So you guys are, 15 years old is I think it's the hardest age. If I look back, I think 15 was the hardest age. And you're at the hardest age and you're forced to isolate. Which, that being said, given the amount of zits I had when I was 15, might have not been the worst thing for me.
Especially with the masks.
Yeah, the math helped that too, yeah. But so can you guys, maybe I'll say this for another day because we are running out of time, but how does that then convince people your age that maybe, unlike young people in 50 years, embrace conservatism?
I would characterize the embrace of conservatism by certain parts of Gen Z.
Yeah, and I want to be clear.
Yeah.
We're not, when we say Gen Z became very conservative, and I think a lot of people are very simplistic when they say that. What they mean is that you've got more younger people embracing a harder version of conservatism than we have seen in 50, 60 years.
Yeah. And it's also important to note that that's a very gendered phenomenon, that many young men are turning to the right and many young women are turning to the left. But I don't think that that has a lot to do with the values of conservatism. I think that that has to do with Gen Z looking for any community they can find anywhere. And Donald Trump is a lot of things, but he is great at creating an in-group and great at creating community. It is his, in my opinion, chief skill as a politician. And so if you're looking around in your bedroom during the spring break that never ended, looking for any kind of community, Donald Trump is right there. And it seems like he cares about you. And all of these friends are right there. And so I think that a lot of it has to do with the fact that there was a supply of people, or pardon me, there was a demand of a community, and Donald Trump happened to supply the community at that moment.
And the people that are, even though you're on spring break forever, you're never allowed to have any fun.
No.
And the people that are in charge of making sure you don't have any fun are generally the most hostile to Donald Trump.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to add on to what Jack said. I don't think it was just, Donald Trump's community was enticing. It's that the other side was the opposite. I think over time, as it was less and less challenged, especially because COVID allowed these ideas to exist outside of reality for a really long time, they got more and more and more limited and more critical of everyone and everything. I remember when it got to the point that trans activists were fighting with lesbian activists because of disagreements over like empowering women and that kind of thing. I know this is a podcast and you can't see me, but I am a tall, straight white man from a middle class family. And so the more and more critical that the left became, the more and more awkward and uncomfortable I felt in the presence of those ideas and the people that shared those ideas, because it felt like I was the unspoken enemy. And that's honestly a lot of how I found the Center for American Institutions and the Politics and Leadership Club, is because I came out of a very left-wing high school and I found a lot of those ideas in full gear in college. And I was looking for something that felt less stifling, anything that didn't feel like I was some kind of enemy. And I think that's especially why a lot of young men were pushed over to conservatism, not just because conservatism was attractive, was because it was very clear that they weren't wanted on the other side, even if they might have agreed more with a lot of the actual policy that the other side offered.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you see some of the most passionate Trump supporters began as Bernie Bros.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Yeah, Democrats are horrible at creating
This
communities.
is terrible.
I say that
I just say this generation.
this generation, and I say that as a Democrat. Like, it's something that we're fundamentally bad at. And the only reason that I avoided what Jake experienced was I grew up as a Democrat in South Dakota. There are 11 of us. And so there simply weren't enough of us to infight. Everybody's friends in a foxhole. And so it was the sense that, and so I just avoided that. But I think that this goes back to the importance of little platoons. And I'm going to plug this again, because that movement of Gen Z men towards Donald Trump, I do not believe would have happened if there was an existing support structure of apolitical communities that they could have turned to. If instead of joining Donald Trump to be in an in-group, they could have joined a bowling league or a book club or what have you, or a fraternal organization, then I do not believe that turn would have existed. The fact is that the sort of community, or the roster of communities, was so depleted that Donald Trump was the only game in town.
Okay, yeah, and I mean, I'm gonna, you know, you're the you plug the Democratic a little bit of the Democratic perspective there, which is good. Let me provide the alternative proof. That in they were running away from leftism regardless, right? Because of the stuff that you were talking about, Jake, like the fact that nobody felt welcome, right? The fact that they remained political, which is something, they could, your generation could have just withdrawn, right? Could have withdrawn. My generation, which is not the generation above me, was the mall rats generation. They could have withdrawn like that, right? Maybe not to the malls because those are all dying, but instead of withdrawing, they remained political. And if you're going to remain political, you're going to go to the other side, right?
Yeah.
And so it's the lack of alternatives to our, even though we have everything at our fingertips. Politics, this maybe especially in this age of Trump, because he's such a master at, as Jake mentioned, getting our attention. So much of your identity is going to be formed by whether you like him or you dislike him. And if you dislike the left because there's no other alternatives, you're going to like him or you're going to support him. But I do come to your point, Jack, that the Gen Z conservatives that I speak to, from a policy perspective, don't seem particularly conservative.
No, absolutely.
Is that your take, Jake?
I think so.
Okay.
I would like to add that I think there are more people stuck in the middle than we might think. Like, yes, there are people part of the left, and there are a lot of people that feel like the right is the only option. But I consider myself as one of the people stuck in this weird sort of middle. I don't feel super welcome on the left because I disagree with a lot of the critical theory that seems to be almost required to be a true part of it. And I also don't feel like welcome on the right because I don't like Donald Trump. And I feel like that is required to be a real part of the right. And so I find myself in this weird middle ground where no one is really fighting for a lot of the policies that I'm interested in, and they're arguing both sides that I disagree with.
So you're an out group for both sides,
Yes.
right? Yeah, that's interesting. Jack, how do you feel about that?
I feel that Jake is a great candidate to join a bowling league. But on a serious note, I agree with everything you said, that in the Democrats pushing so many people like Jake, away, and the fact that there was just no apolitical alternative, that people naturally joined Donald Trump, even people who don't necessarily agree with his policies. And so then that leads to apathy amongst people in the middle. I agree with Jake in that there are many people in the middle. And unlike Jake, many of them have become apathetic about politics because they can't join either party because they don't fulfill either party's criteria.
They don't make it through the litmus test.
Correct. Absolutely. And so what are they to do other than to disengage with politics? But the problem is there's nowhere else for them to go. The malls are dead. The little platoons are gone. What are they supposed to do with their lives? And so that is the fundamental
And
problem.
and on top of that, even if they were dead anyway, you lost what alternative, maybe what could have flowered, what else could have flowered in their wake was destroyed by COVID.
Yes.
Yeah.
Or at least delayed by COVID.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Interesting. All right. Well, I am gonna just kind of, I am gonna try to wrap this up because we are at that point. But any final thoughts on this?
I just want to add that I do see more people as a part of Gen Z seeking community outside of the two camps that seem so like,
Hegemonic.
yes. And I see more people looking for the kind of little platoons that Jack has plugged twice now.
I think it was three times.
3 times. And I think I want to just give a shout out to everyone that goes to the Politics and Leadership Club, because I think that's an example of that, of a little platoon. And what I see happening there is people that feel disaffected by lots of different things coming together and actually having reasonable conversation. I know a lot of my friends, both on the left and right, are starting to calm down a little bit. It's not everybody. And I don't like to spend too much time with people that are super radical because they kind of just wears down on you. But I do think Gen Z is growing up a little bit and realizing that extreme ideas on both sides are not productive if you want to have a career, live in a nice community, have a good relationship with your coworkers, have a good relationship. That's its own discussion, Gen Z and dating. But I think I am optimistic that Gen Z is realizing the merits of moderating and not obsessing so much over their own identities.
My final thought would be very similar to Jake's final thought. And I'm going to plug little platoons a fourth time. I would say to any person, especially if you're Gen Z listening to this, go knock on your neighbor's door and get to know them. The only way that we can get out of this point where everybody feels like they're fighting with one another and everybody feels on edge politically is to get to know people you don't agree with. And an element of that is moderation. Moderation naturally occurs when you converse with people you don't agree with and you find yourself drawn to some of their views. Edmund Burke was a conservative. I don't agree with many of the things he believed, but I agree with this. And so
Little platoons, to
yeah.
be clear.
Uh-huh. And so the only way out of this is to talk to people you don't agree with. And I would encourage you to do that.
Well, I mean, in the end, your generation missed out on 2 years of talking to people.
Yes.
Yeah, during 2 very important years.
2 very important years, so gotta make up for lost time. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, and, yeah, looking forward to doing this again very shortly.
Thank you for having us.